Hello, folks. Welcome. Welcome. So before we begin, I want to remind all attendees to please sign in using the link provided in the chat. This sign-in sheet link will be provided by Joanna Juarez. If you have any issues signing in, please direct message her. If you have any questions during the course of the presentation, just go ahead and type them into the chat. This is going to be more of a free flow conversation, so audience engagement is very much encouraged, and our presenters will be able to address them. Also, a short survey will also be shared in the chat by Joanna Juarez, and please take a couple of minutes just to complete that. It's very important to us. If any GCC registered students would like to be eligible for our raffle for our event this evening, please be sure to complete the post-event survey. Okay, the last survey question will ask for your GCC student ID number, which will enter you into our raffle. We also have ASL interpretation services by Christina and Gutri, and closed captioning provided by Patty. And you can enable closed captioning by selecting live transcript at the bottom of your Zoom application and enabling captions. So thank you to our ASL interpretation and closed captioning team for being here. Lastly, there's a reminder that this event will be recorded, so please adjust your settings to your preference. So before I introduce our presenter today, I want to offer a land acknowledgement on behalf of the Planning Committee. Every community owes its existence and vitality to generations from around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy to making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will, some were drawn to leave their distant homes in hope of a better life, and some have lived on this land for more generations that can be counted. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We begin this effort to acknowledge what has been buried by honoring the truth. We are currently occupying ancestral land of the Tongva people. In our work to promote social justice and education, we must always consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that brings us together here today. With that logistics being out of the way, I'd like to welcome you all to this evening's presentation and introduce Aileen Louie, who is the current Vice President of Asian Americans Advancing Justice in Los Angeles. In this discussion, Aileen will discuss her experiences as a student, mother, and advocate for social justice movements within the AAPI community. She will discuss what it takes to balance personal and professional needs while maintaining a commitment to resiliency within the AAPI community. And we're gonna go ahead and pin also Mike Dulai, who's the current chair of the Social Sciences Division and professor of psychology. He will also be assisting with this event. So I'm gonna go ahead and hand it off to Aileen and Mike.
Well, welcome everybody. We're hoping tonight will feel a bit more like a conversation where the participants can sit in on Aileen and I having a conversation or a cup of coffee, talking about her life experiences and the way that they've certainly inspired me and that they may help inform and inspire all of our guests tonight. So let's start with a little bit of background, Aileen. Could you tell us about your background as an older teen and young adult? What drew you to Asian American studies?
Well, I will say I grew up as a Navy kid. So we lived in many different places throughout the country. As a very young child, I lived up and down the East Coast. And there were many times I will say I was one of the only either Black or white students in a school. So that feeling of isolation was very prominent in kind of my younger life. And then my family eventually retired in San Diego, where we found a very large, specifically Filipino American community there, and kind of forgot what it meant to not be part of the majority anymore, since everyone I knew kind of had that shared experience. Eventually, I had the opportunity to go to UCLA, and I think that experience was very pivotal in introducing me to a broader kind of, political mindset and really helping to define my values. I think like most students, when you're getting involved with student organizations, it's mostly a social thing. You're kind of following friends that are interested in some similar things to myself and learning kind of the campus and each other. I will say there was a very specific moment, because I always remember it very vividly, where I was helping out doing campus tours with Filipino high school students, encouraging to come to think about college and potentially apply to UCLA. And I was with friends, we were doing some tours, and we got our groups together just to do some, more one-on-one conversations. And somebody was jogging up and down the steps where we were sitting. And they bumped into one of the students. And she turned to us and she looked at us and she said, "Why don't you guys all go back to where you came from?" And then she proceeded to like continue to run there. And then I had a good friend who was like not having that. So like ran after her and got in her face about like, what did you mean by that? Because we were there with high school students convincing them that they needed to come and join us at institutions of higher education. And then to hear that they weren't welcome in that space took away everything that we were trying to do. So for me, that realization that I am still seen as an other kind of came back. And I think that really was a catalyst for me to learn more about my community, learn more about my role in the community and in the broader society. So I think that was really kind of the spark of a lot of different things.
Yeah, I didn't know that. And we've known each other for quite some time. That's a powerful story.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask, since we have so many students here, a related question. In what ways has your educational background prepared you for challenges beyond traditional academic matters?
Well, the degree has a tremendous amount of value. I was a philosophy major, which then everybody says, what do you do with a philosophy major? Are you going to teach or are you going to go to law school? But I actually have found that almost any liberal arts major has really honed critical thinking skills that have value across, many different careers and situations. And it has served me incredibly well in the work that I have done. The other thing that I will say about my college experience that kind of helped to launch me to where, I am now is I think I learned a lot outside of the classroom that has been incredibly valuable to my work. So being involved with student organizations, learning how to run a meeting, learning how to plan programs, learning how to put together budgets have all been really critical pieces and, foundational stones that I've like drawn on and built upon as I continue my work beyond the campus. And it really kind of, moved me into areas that I never really thought about, when I was a student, because I did it because it was kind of fun and it was important to me, not necessarily thinking that it would lead me to a career.
So are there specific organizations that come to mind that?
Well, for me at UCLA, I was very involved with the Samhang Filipino, which is the Filipino student organization there. And I will own the fact that the landscape of community organizations looks very different than when I was there 30 something years ago. But also I got involved with the Undergraduate Student Association. I was the director of the Asian Pacific Coalition, which at the time was an umbrella organization of 20 or 20 something Asian Pacific Islander organizations on campus, and we kind of represented ourselves to the broader student organizations. And then I did a lot of kind of programming work, a lot of proposal writing and fundraising. We were fortunate at UCLA to have access to different pools of money, but you still had to go through processes to be able to secure those resources. And I learned a lot in terms of like how to present a compelling argument as to why issues were important to us, how we wanted to address them on campus, and why we needed resources to be able to do that. And ultimately, that's what led me to my first job within what was then called the Asian Pacific American Legal Center, which is now Advancing Justice LA.
That's wonderful life advice about figuring out where to find the resources to make the changes you want.
Yeah.
You mentioned Advancing Justice. Can you talk to us about what the organization is, what it does?
Well, Asian Americans Advancing Justice is, I guess at our core, we are the legal advocates on behalf of the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities here in Los Angeles. We have a cadre of staff that are providing individual legal assistance to folks in our community that cannot afford to hire attorneys. And we work in the area of immigration. We protect domestic violence victims. We work on eviction defense. And we also work on some employment law cases. So that's the direct services side. We also have a pretty robust area of work that's focused more on systems change. So we have policy advocates. We're very active in Sacramento at state policy levels. And we also have what we call an impact litigation team, which are looking for broader caseworks that set precedents that protect our communities. We're active in the areas of voting rights, as well as we've been very active in the fight to save affirmative action, which runs counter to what many people in our community actually would like to see us do. So we're a very social justice minded organization. And while we have an independent organization here in LA, we're also part of a broader national affiliation where we have affiliate partners in San Francisco, Chicago, DC, and Atlanta.
Wow, that's terrific. You mentioned affirmative action. I want to expand on that by hearing your thoughts about the ways that we should communicate the struggles of other groups.
Well, I think that one of the things that we've focused on is that it's not just a matter of working in partnership with other communities, but it's also in service to our own community that we have to continue to fight to protect affirmative action, right? More across the board. Our ability to kind of see a whole person and make evaluations kind of thinking about the whole person is critical in the areas of education, employment, government contracting. You have to be able to put people in context, and you can't do that without affirmative action. So,
now on the broader scale, I was wrestling with whether or not I was going to show clips of some of the current anti-Asian violence that's gripping, particularly the Bay Area.
Yeah.
When we see images where it looks like one person of color is attacking another person of color, what do you think is the best way to communicate those challenges to the broader population?
Well, I think that you guys all kind of recognize that these issues are incredibly complicated, right? And I think that one of the things that we are really focused on is the idea of dispelling like this model minority myth that as an Asian and Pacific Islander community that we are somehow separate and different from other communities, other disenfranchised communities and other communities of color, like that we are all kind of in this together. And any efforts to kind of paint us as separate actually ultimately undermines all of our positions in our society. Like we're not going to allow ourselves to be pitted against each other. But that doesn't mean that these individual cases of hate and violence between two people are not going to sometimes happen between one person of color and another person of color, right? I think that I think we kind of recognize that that's true, but I don't know that that has to be a statement in terms of how collectively our communities are relating to one another,
Yeah, no, it's sometimes too easy for folks to look at a short video clip.
Yes.
And then make really broad statements and just miss the bigger picture. So.
Yes.
Now, as it relates to the organization you work for, can you talk to us about the challenges of having a leadership role in such a large organization?
Well, what I will say is, when I started my career, which I didn't even really think was as a career, but really when I started working within the legal center, you always think that you want to be in a leadership position. You always think that you want to be a part of that decision-making table until you're there, and then you realize how hard it is. and then you kind of wish that you weren't. So because in many ways it's just easier for other people to kind of make decisions and tell you what they need for you to do. But I think that the challenges for me in terms of being in a leadership position is really the ongoing idea that you have to think organizationally, you have to think broadly, right? Like there isn't the ability to really, we can't always be thinking of individualized services or individualized programs or even issues, but there's the constant need to kind of work in balance about how these different things are related to one another, how these issues are related to one another. And if we respond one way, let's say on an immigration issue, does that in fact compromise what we're doing in terms of combating anti-Asian hate? So like figuring out that balance, I think is an ongoing thing. And then the other piece that I will say is that it's, while the issues and how they impact the community is what brought me to the work, I also now understand that part of my job is to ensure that we are building a healthy community institution, right? So there's like a whole business element to this work that when you think of yourself as a young advocate that's kind of wanting to be part of the movement, is not really what you see. Like nobody's talking about how do we raise money to be able to, pay for staff to do this work. And when you've got a lot of staff that have a lot of needs, we're not thinking about how do we train our staff? Like, how do we make sure that we have the right things in place to be able to protect our staff or ensure that work that is getting done that we need to get done. So there's a whole different kind of business element that is also central in terms of being in a leadership role here.
Yeah, thanks. That's a broad answer, and I think that for many, especially if I could remember back to being a student, I don't think about all those other things.
Yes.
And I in a way, I guess I'm part of an organizational hub at the college right now, and you end up thinking about more things than maybe a lot of us would consider. Now, for the students that might be thinking that they do want to go into social justice work, and this might be a path, can you paint a picture of what a normal work week looks like for you?
Well, I guess I'm trying to figure out, like, if you want to hear about my very boring work week now, as opposed to maybe when I started, which was, kind of very different. Like when I started at the Legal Center, the organization was small. I started a very long time ago, close to 30 years ago. And I think that we had less than 20 people on staff. And then now the organization grew to almost 125. We had to kind of restructure. And now I think the organization is probably sitting closer to 75, which is probably really, honestly, our sweet spot in terms of like the staffing that we want to be able to maintain. So I think a lot of my time, honestly, is really more, my role is specifically to oversee our ongoing fundraising and communications work. So there's a lot of conversations about potential, who's kind of interested in work, how are we elevating our work to generate interest in what we're doing, and facilitating a lot of those conversations, and then thinking through if we understand potential donors and what they're interested in, what we have to offer that might be able to connect to their interests, and without necessarily changing the essence of the work that we do on the ground. So I think that is constant meetings about potential funders and what that looks like, and how we can make connections probably dominates most of my time. And then there's a lot of more kind of management things that I spend a lot of time on, which I will say I hate spending time on, looking at things like comp studies to make sure that, like, do we have to make changes to our salary scales, or are we doing the right HR processes, or IT stuff, which I really suck at, and trying to figure out like how are we equipping our staff to actually be the most effective they can be in the work that they need to do. So while I understand the importance of that work, it's not really the stuff that I love. The things that I really like to do are thinking about what are the things that are happening in our community, what are we as an organization prepared to do to support, and then thinking about where do we get the resources to ensure that that work can happen. I think that's kind of my sweet spot in terms of things that I really enjoy doing here.
Yeah, no, I've seen you advocate for things not related to your job, but I
Yeah.
think you're very good at it. Just if, I don't know how much you can share, but if we're talking about, you know, gathering resources for a social justice agency, does it typically work best? I mean, do these agencies run on one or a couple of very large donors, or are they a lot of small donors, or how do you maintain that balance?
I think there's a lot of different models, and a lot of different nonprofit organizations run differently. Like I will say in LA, we have a large number of social service organizations that are focused on the Asian Pacific Islander community, since that's what we're kind of talking about today.
Mm-hmm.
Most of those are largely government funded. So they have a handful of large government contracts that provide a steady stream of resources. Our organization is different. And I think some of that is because of the advocacy work that we do. It does not attract a lot of government funding.
Sure.
So we have some government funding that supports our services, direct services work, but we work with a large number of private foundations, largely. I would say 85% of our budget comes from some kind of programmatic grants. And of that, the majority of them are coming from private foundations. At any one time, we are managing anywhere from 60 to 70 individual program grants within the organization.
Wow.
And in these last few months, actually, we have made a lot of headway in terms of bringing individual donors into the organization in the wake of what we're seeing in terms of anti-Asian hate.
Yeah, I can unfortunately imagine.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to transition here and talk about
Sure.
the balance piece of all this, and then hopefully by the time, you know, we can back out and then look at the bigger picture again. Can you tell us about your home life from, you know, when you started and to where you are now? And I mean, it's obviously as much as you're comfortable sharing. Yeah.
Which is a lot, as Mike knows, because and I like to overshare. But I started at the legal center when I was relatively young. I was 24 when I started here. It's like one of my first jobs out of undergraduate school, and I don't have a graduate degree. So, and I will say I worked here for 20 years as in different kind of fundraising and management positions. After 20, you know, in that period of time, I started a family. I had 3 kids and was looking for ways to continue to work because this is work that I'm passionate about, but also balance the demands of a family. So I was changing positions because I didn't want to work as much. I at one point in time, I think I transitioned to part-time. And it came to the point where we were having some financial kind of tensions within the organization. And I knew it didn't make sense for my position to be a part-time position. We needed more people on the ground. So, and I had more demands as my kids were like in elementary school, where I decided that I would leave the organization. So I actually left Advancing Justice and focused on being a stay-at-home parent for about 8 years. That's when I met Mike, because I actually live across the street from the college and our kids were all at the same elementary school. So I spent 8 years as a stay-at-home parent. And once my kids were getting into high school and then into college, I realized I didn't really need to be doing that anymore. There wasn't anyone at home waiting for me to give them a ride or to cook them a meal. So I was trying to figure out how to get back into the workforce. And I was incredibly blessed that this organization invited me back. So I came back, was doing grant writing here, and kind of re-entered the organization at a very challenging time within the organization, and quickly found myself in different kinds of leadership positions here. So yeah, that's.
Are there challenges, you know, that maybe you experienced or that you learned from about balancing work and, you know, and family? There's some advice that, you know.
Well, I think that there's several things that I learned, and some of it was like, for me, as passionate as I am about the work of this organization and my commitment to, you know, this kind of work, I had to be really clear on my own personal priorities, you know, like, and I think that I came to think about it this way, like in terms of like, at the end of the day, like, what am I really offering this world and what is my legacy? And at least for me, the answer to that question was ultimately my children. Like that is going to be my ultimate, you know, contribution to the organization. And not to say that the work that I've done here hasn't been meaningful, but I'm just one piece of a lot of people that are doing the work on behalf of this organization. That's not true when I think about my kids. So, which is why I think I ultimately decided that I was going to step away from my work. And when I did that, I don't think that I necessarily had a plan that I was going to return to this organization. I definitely wouldn't have waited 8 years to do it if that's what I thought I was going to do. But as the demands of my family lessened, I think that I kind of recognized, you kind of reassess again, like, what is it that really is meaningful to me? Where do I need to invest my time? Where I feel like I'm being at most useful? And I think that those are the kinds of questions that led me back, you know, coming, you know, I was thinking about like returning to work, but I also knew that it had to be something that was meaningful for me. I am incredibly privileged to be in a situation where I am not the primary breadwinner of my family. So if I'm electing to work, then I want it to be something that is meaningful for me, where I feel like I am making a difference, which I recognize most people don't have the opportunity to be able to do that. So.
Yeah. No, that's, thank you for sharing that. That more than I thought you would share. But thank you. I want to maybe transition and think about the kids, right? And
Sure.
generational differences, because that's its own challenge nowadays, I think. And so if thinking about generational differences, right? How evident are they, or how impactful are they when you think about the work that's being done in the community, or even in your work at home, having to interact with, you know, children, your own children?
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting time for the question, because my daughter is a freshman at UCLA and now kind of entering and getting involved with many of the same student organizations that I was involved in when I was a student there too. So there's a little bit of like deja vu, but also like recognizing how different that work looks.
Yeah.
You know, as she's engaging it and compared to what I did when I was there. Like, I think, you know, thinking about the Asian Pacific Islander community organizations in LA, one of the things that I'm kind of recognizing is we have well-established organizations that are still led, many of them, by their founders who are transitioning away from their organization. That's something that we went through recently here. And how like a younger generation kind of interacts and relates to these organizations is definitely a challenge, right? Because we had a really old guard leadership that wasn't necessarily in tune with like how a new generation communicates with one another, or even how we talked about our work didn't necessarily, we couldn't talk about it in a way that resonated to a younger generation. When you've got, you know, our executive director and founder who's well into his 60s and has his own kind of network and spheres of influence. There are things that I don't know that we've been very good at in terms of how we're kind of communicating, and also as a well-established organization in terms of how we're bringing and inviting a new generation of leaders into the space. So I do think that there's definitely challenges in that. And I think that the result has been in the LA kind of experience is we've seen a lot, there's a number of new organizations that are being formed in this moment too, because, you know, you've got a lot of energy and passion from a younger generation that are having a hard time finding their place in these established community institutions. So they're creating their own kinds of things. And I think one of the things that's sometimes missing is trying to figure out how we're all going to work together in the space. So sometimes there's conflict. There's sometimes kind of misunderstanding, but there's also opportunities to really grow and expand and deepen the work.
Yeah, no, that I think that's important for everybody to understand, especially people getting out into the field, right? It is tempting to just go your own way and come up with your own rules, but there are systems out there, and I think we're stronger when we all work together.
Yeah, and I will say, like, you know, when I was making the transition between, you know, being a student advocate and then starting to kind of work in the community, I will be very honest and say that I don't even really know that I appreciated what that meant, you know, like, because the campus community is very different than like the community that is actually living and working and experiencing things, you know, in LA. And there's a certain amount of humility that kind of has to happen as you're kind of figuring out your place in that
In the
landscape.
broader community, the political dynamic. Yeah, I agree. Can you share with us some of your more, I'm going to use a big word here, aspirational word, triumphant moments while working at the organization?
I will say I love this organization, and we've been through some very challenging times recently, but and I am incredibly proud of a lot of the work that we've done and that I have been involved in. And, you know, dude, I know I'm old, but some of the things that I'm most proudest of was, like, I was actually working here during the 1992 civil unrest, right? So I remember being in press conferences, and our offices were actually downtown. We're in downtown Los Angeles, and I remember being at holding a press conference in our building and having the police come and shut it down because we had, you know, rioters like 2 blocks away from where we were. And also, you know, making the rounds with our then executive director at all these Korean American churches and trying to figure out what people needed. And while we are a legal organization at our core, one of the things that I was asked to do was to help organize food distribution to these Korean churches. And when I asked why we were doing that, because, you know, it's really not our thing, our executive director basically said, because we need to. You know, like, we had strong relationships with different businesses and corporations that we could leverage to help get people what they need. So the idea that as a community organization and community institution, that we weren't going to be limited by what our role was, but really respond to a community need was incredibly powerful. And I was just so proud to be able to help in that way. The other thing that I think that I'm especially proud of in terms of my involvement here is that our organization is very committed to working across communities. Like, we are very committed to ongoing partnership and collaboration with other disenfranchised communities and other communities of color. And that's very much a core of who we are. Most of the work that we do is done in collaborations with other organizations. That is very hard and very challenging, but it's a very core to who we are as Advancing Justice LA. And I'm incredibly proud that we are willing to kind of take that hard path if that makes our community stronger. So
yes, those are definitely things to be proud of. Are there particular challenges that you could remember? I mean, apart from some of the organizational stuff you remembered, I mean, social justice challenges that were, you know, disappointing, that you could share with?
Yeah, I mean, I can think of ones that are even recent. I mean, you know, when we were able to kind of, you know, bring the question of affirmative action to the ballot box in November, that's a campaign that our office was very involved in. To see it fail was incredibly disappointing. And while we can feel like we turned the needle a little bit within our own, you know, Asian American and Pacific Islander communities, we know that we lost a lot of our community in that fight. So I think that continues to be disappointing to us here. And, you know, the other piece is, you know, just thinking about Black Lives Matter and the murder of George Floyd. which I think that for many of us, I will say definitely within our organization, we felt that at our core, to not see a lot of other Asian and Pacific Islander advocates kind of jump into this issue until the until the spike in anti-Asian hate violence was also kind of disappointing.
Yeah, I agree.
That people don't necessarily see them as connected, and it wasn't until the attack was on us that you saw more people come out. And not that people didn't come out from our community, because they did, but it didn't necessarily resonate the same. And I've been in conversations with a lot of people who are always asking about, well, where's the Black community in terms of supporting us? But where were you when other things were happening too? So
Yeah, oh, that definitely challenges.
yeah.
Can you because I think since we have a room here, right? Can you talk maybe briefly, just a statement of why affirmative action is important in the Asian American community, or as part of what the organization is pushing for?
I think that access and opportunity is critical for communities like ours, who are seen as being separate and different, and I think that affirmative action always matters. Like, I know that there's a lot of focus on affirmative action in the education admissions space, but affirmative action is actually much broader than that. It's not just about college admissions. It's about employment. It's about who gets government contracts. And if we acknowledge that our communities are oftentimes locked out of those spaces, then you have to be able to, embrace and uplift the need for affirmative action. Until we can say that everyone has equal access and opportunity to all these different things, you cannot say that there is not a need for affirmative action. And I will also go as far to say that, like, if you really dig into the data, it's not enough to just uplift people based on income and economic class. There are other ways that people are being held back. And if race is still an issue, affirmative action still has to be in place, right? And even if that means that maybe there are going to be, less people from certain communities to give other people, access, I think as a whole, our communities still benefit in that process. So.
Yeah, no, I agree. Thank you. There's a great follow-up here from one of our political scientists. Law schools and the legal profession are not particularly diverse.
Mm-hmm.
What would you tell a student who might not consider going into the legal profession about the value of having more diversity in the legal field and in general, and for activism in particular?
I think that, well, I find a little bit of irony because I am not an attorney. So one, and then two, like I will say, oftentimes people will come to intern here at Advancing Justice thinking that they want to become lawyers and deciding after working here that they don't want to do that like anymore. So, but I do think that that a legal degree oftentimes gives you access to a language that ultimately can create systems change within our society. So the more adept you are at being in that language and moving through those spaces, the more you can do in terms of really providing advocacy and protection and uplifting our community. And in the end, I think people are sensitive to trying to watch out for each other, but we have to be a part of that process, right? Like, we have to have folks from our community that are prepared to be advocates on behalf of our community. We can't ask everybody else to do that for us. So, I think we need a strong legal, access to like strong legal advocates in our community in order to be able to uplift the needs of our community. I think the challenge for our community, I would, there are a lot of Asian attorneys. The challenge is getting them to be more community minded. So
I appreciate that. You mentioned earlier the challenge of, and we've talked about this, trying to find a way to organize change in large organizations, particularly as they grow and shrink. And one of these challenges, I think, to keep it all in perspective, I want to ask what your thoughts are about justice on a broader scale. Like, what does it really mean to have justice as a society?
Gee, when I invited hard questions, I guess I didn't really expect that kind of hard question. but I do think that I think, if in the United States, what we are going to, one of the things that we as a country will say defines us is that everyone should have equal access to opportunity, right? This whole idea that immigrants can come to the United States with nothing in their pocket and make their way and find success. I mean, that is the epitome of the American story. So when we think about justice in the United States, the question is, do people really have equal access and opportunity and those opportunities to really better themselves? Or are there structural barriers that will keep people from, attaining that success? And if we see that there are structural barriers, if we see evidence that there are specific, ethnic communities, specific, whether it's an immigrant community, don't have the same kinds of opportunities, then we can't say that we live in a just and equitable society, right? So I think that maybe that would be my definition of justice, in terms of looking and ensuring that, as in our country that prides ourselves in terms of this equal opportunity, that is in fact a true statement.
Sure. I'm looking at the time here. I have other questions about being a student that I want to ask, but there was a relatively long comment in the chat that I just want to address head on. I don't, a part of the reason why we're organizing events like this and having broader conversations with people with experience in the field, it's not so much to puff up one organization versus another. I invited Aileen Louie here to help us understand what it's like to work in an organization, not to defend particularly whatever the organization might have done throughout its longer history. So I think that's really important, right? So if with that in mind, Aileen, I want to ask a couple of questions about being an individual in an organization, right? Because I know when I look at organizational change, one of the big challenges is when you have so many different people trying to move something forward as generations continue to roll into it. And the work of it can certainly get challenging. And now what I want to do is just peel that all the way back down to being a college student, right? If you had to give advice to college students about being part of an organization and getting into systems that can make change rather than trying to fight the whole system on your own, right? I think, I'm assuming most of us in the room understand that if I was to go out and try to fight for justice on my own, it's challenging. And so when you start to work with other people, that can get really messy. Is there advice that you have for college students that are trying to make change on a much broader scale so that they don't have to feel alone in doing it?
Well, I think that as I think about my own time in terms of the advocacy that I had an opportunity to do when I was still a college student, as opposed to kind of work that I was able to do after leaving college. One, like I said, I think that that's a tougher transition that people think that it's going to be. There's a lot of what I found for myself is, even though I knew a lot of folks in the community from my time on campus, it was a different thing kind of having to reprove that you were really committed to the work, and that was humbling when I started. the other thing that I would say is I oftentimes think that I had a very idealistic view of what it would mean to work work in the community, right? There's often this perception that if we want to really work on, for the community, we can't necessarily take care of ourselves. Like, you're going to accept a job where you're going to get paid less money than other jobs that you could get. And as you get older and have other kinds of responsibilities, then it becomes harder, right, to continue to accept wages that don't allow you to actually have and support a family, right? So I think that there's work to be done within community organizations that will allow people to continue to work in the long term, because I think oftentimes what we see is people incredibly passionate coming out of college, throwing themselves into the work, accepting kind of positions because they're so committed to the work that they're doing, where they can't support themselves in the long term. Oftentimes, community organizations, ours included, don't always have a really, formalized staff development. Here we can plot out a career path that will allow you to stay in the work for a long period of time. So maybe after a few years, when people are ready to start families, they'll leave these organizations and go work in the private sector, go work in the government sector, because they have to be able to, take care of themselves and their families. So I think there's a lot that we have to do as community organizations, community institutions, to be able to keep people, support people better. But there's also, like, for individuals, like, kind of recognizing that it's not just a passion project, but we have to be prepared to, like, build careers in these different spaces, which are going to call us to do different things.
Thank you. Thank you. Last question, and then we'll open it up. Are there people or organizations that have sustained your energy, right, early on when you started and now?
I'm sorry?
Are there people or organizations that have helped sustain your energy, right, as an advocate when you first started as a student early on and even through today?
I think that I've had an opportunity to work with lots of different, community organizations. And, I think a lot about, like, for us, for me, like, I would kind of consider, like, more kind of mainstream organizations, like the Legal Aid Foundation of LA, even organizations like the ACLU. And I'm appreciating how much they are doing to really try to serve a broader group of people and be relevant with our, in different communities. So I think that that's incredibly inspiring. And I think the other thing that I see that's exciting is the number of civic engagement groups that are forming and are present, particularly focused on the Asian Pacific Islander communities, that I think ultimately give us an opportunity to really strengthen our political voice here as well.
Well, thank you, Aileen. I want to open the floor up. If there are questions, if you can put them in the chat. I see commentary that I'm not denying. I think that it's good to have dialogue. That's the whole point of these events like this. But if there are specific questions, I don't know if they were sent to Aditi. Kevin, can you refresh my memory?
Yeah, Aditi, did you get any questions? Direct message?
Yeah, no questions at the moment.
Okay, well, I don't know. I'm just reading through the chat here. So that, yeah, there's some posts about restructuring at Advancing Justice, and I don't know if you want to address those. Don't have to. I wanted to, let me ask one more question. Again, if you'd like to, that's perfectly fine. I want to kind of close this at least for my questions, about your closing thoughts about what it is like, again, just going back to the idea of having to make decisions about work-life balance. I know you said you left the organization for a time, but did that affect you when you were a student getting ready to go into a field, and when you got the job? Did it impact the way you made decisions about how you were going to plan your personal life and your family life?
I will be very honest in saying that I've never been all that deliberate about making those decisions. That I think that one of the things, I've just been kind of open to different opportunities. And for me personally, like, I kind of understand like the work that I want to see happen in the community. And my biggest interest is trying to understand how I could be, what I had to offer to best leverage and move that work forward. So I'm not an attorney, so it may not necessarily be that I'm going to be the one that is, helping people with their immigration problems. But I have other skills that can help to, allow that work and set a stage for that work to be able to happen. So I think that that's kind of been the way that I've thought about it, and just being open to the opportunities as they have kind of appeared in front of me, really.
Thank you. Thank you. There's a comment from one of our instructors about the House passing the bill about hate crimes directed at Asian Americans. So that's certainly exciting news.
Mm-hmm.
That's all. Are we at near? Well, we're not quite there. If there are no other questions, or if you know,
Mike, there is
Yes.
one.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just pull it up.
Sure.
Okay, so it was, is Asian Americans Advancing Justice associated or affiliated with the Asian American Legal Defense and Educational Fund?
We are separate organizations. ALDEF is based in New York, and their focus is primarily like kind of the New York area. They do a lot of voting rights work, and in the course of doing that work, they've kind of expanded into different areas. We partner with them on different casework and pieces of litigation, but we don't have a formal tie with them in the same way that we have with our other affiliates in San Francisco, DC, Chicago, and Atlanta.
Thank you, Aditi, and thanks, Aileen. There is one more question, and I'm just going to read it because it came through from one of the guests. So how do you reconcile AJ's mission statement with one of pursuing equity while laying off workers living paycheck to paycheck and being forced to resort to GoFundMe donations to survive?
So I will say that the organizational challenges here had been kind of the result of the fact that the organization really, the organization grew too quickly without really thinking about how it was going to sustain and support the work. Like, there was really very little organizational infrastructure that has been deliberately built here. And I will say, as an example, that when I left the organization in 2009, we probably had 5 administrative focused staff and a staff of about 70. When I returned about 4 years ago, the staff was 125, and we had the same 5 administrative staff people. So under the weight of that, we saw a situation where the organization started to kind of come apart. At the same time, we had our very prominent founding executive director starting to transition away from advancing justice because of his own health kinds of issues. So ultimately, we had to downsize the organization because we didn't have enough money to support the staff configuration that we had. And I will say, as it was very apparent to me as someone who had been away for the organization for a long period of time, that that needed to happen. I never in my life ever thought that I would actually have to be a participant in making that happen. So it's probably one of the worst times of my professional life. So it was an incredibly painful process of trying to right size the organization, and one that as a staff, we were not really prepared to do on our own. So there were, at a certain point, we could not kind of deal with this like as a family, which is mostly how we tried to deal with things within the organization for a long period of time. And a lot of other people kind of got involved with how to address a lot of the internal challenges of the organization. So I'm going to say, honestly, I feel like there was a period of time where we kind of lost control of it. And a lot of the conversation was really focused on balancing the budget and trying to figure out what was sustainable, which I think, with a very definitive business hat is kind of what needed to happen. But kind of how that was done and the pain of that process was a very personal one. And I don't know that there is ever a good way to ultimately do that. I think there were a lot of different things that were tried to help reconcile what was happening within the organization. But I think in reality, there wasn't a strong enough infrastructure to support the growth of the exponential growth of our programming, and it started to collapse from the inside, which is, I think, my big lesson learned as having to kind of work through that process is we have to be mindful about not just doing the work on behalf of our communities, but how we're building community institutions that can last. And ultimately ensuring that those institutions can support the people that work there. Like this can't just be like, everybody's really excited about doing the work. They're gonna work for less money than they need until they burn out and decide to do something else. We have to build something that's stronger than that.
Yeah. Thank you, Aileen. I hadn't intended to go that far down that road. And I appreciate you engaging the comments. They're important. And I think what they say to me is that social justice isn't, a perfect practice. We, particularly those of us that have been involved in this kind of work for a long time, find ourselves put in positions that we never would have expected when we were in college, when we were starting out, when we wanted to fight the good fight. And we sometimes end up inheriting structural problems that were created by somebody else, or they were created kind of by romantic or idealist approaches to social change. And throughout history, right, if I think any good sociology class, a good labor history class shows that we see organizations sometimes rise and then they fall apart, they implode on themselves. And so I did want to, recognize that and really thank you very much for your time. I appreciate everything you shared. I think it's a good insight into the world of large scale organizational change. And it does help students make decisions about their academic plans, especially those who might have majored in philosophy.
Who knew?
Yeah. So with that, thank you, everybody. I know, Kevin, we had until 6, right?
Yes, until 6.
Okay. So again, thank you, everybody, for being here. Appreciate it. Kevin, were there closing comments that I was supposed to say? I apologize.
Oh, no worries. I just wanted to thank you, Mike, for facilitating the conversation, our wonderful division chair of social sciences, and Aileen taking time out of your busy schedule to share your wisdom and story with our campus. We sincerely thank you. Thank you to our ASL interpretation and captioning team. As always, you have been fantastic. And then don't forget to complete the survey that's been in the chat there. So just go ahead and click on it and take a couple of minutes to let us know what you think. So With that being said, we hope you have a great evening. We have additional events coming up this week. We have a student panel tomorrow evening and then a professional panel the evening after. So hopefully we'll be able to see you all there. So thank you, folks, and have a great night. Thank you.
Hey, Mike, are we done? Was that helpful?
It was. There's still a few folks in the room.
Let me go ahead and